kind of scary stuff if you think about it. The climate crisis, what's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? What's going to happen to our kids if we do decide on having kids? Many of us want kids. So firstly, to the stage, I'd like to invite Clover Hogan. She's a climate activist and founder and executive director of Force of Nature. Please have a seat anywhere. Great music. Next up, we have Wawa Gatheru. She's the founder and executive director of Black Girl Environmentalist. Nice to see you. All right, next we have Sheifunmi Adebote. He is an environmentalist and host of Climate Talk podcast. And last but not least, we have Reem Saffar. She is the media group director of Uprising International. Okay, let's get to this. Who here is extremely afraid of what's to come? Why? Let's start with you.
So, I think why the climate crisis is huge. It's overwhelming. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions about climate anxiety is that it stems from the enormity of the challenge, when in fact what we've learned at Force of Nature by researching and talking to thousands of young people around the world is that their anxiety and feelings of powerlessness stem from inaction in the face of the climate crisis. So it's looking to the people in elected positions of power, whether it's politicians or business leaders, and seeing this continued denial, seeing this sleepwalking even as the science tells us we're hurtling toward this cliff of climate collapse. So it's very easy as a young person who's going to inherit the worst impacts of the climate crisis to feel a great sense of despair and anxiety.
So you're suggesting there is still hope. We'll come back to that in a minute. Wawa, why are you afraid?
Oh my goodness, why am I afraid? The reality is that young people around the world, we are experiencing so many different compounded crises. The ecological breakdown that we're seeing with the climate crisis, which is a circumstance that we did not make happen. We were born into it. And if we actually look at who are the focal culprits, it actually wasn't our families, it wasn't our grandparents or parents. So there's a lot of guilt around feeling as though there is this big issue, we didn't cause it, but I don't know how to participate and figure out how to deal with it. But also all these other crises that we're experiencing, once in a lifetime pandemic that's still happening, economic breakdown, people are struggling to live a life beyond survival. And as a young person, that makes me really fearful because I don't have a future that is certain. It's hard for me to make plans about what I want to do with my future. It's hard for me to even think about if I want to start a family one day. However, it's really important to really lean into that hope that you were talking about, that radical hope, to not just sit in the despair, but to actually think about this moment and say, the climate crisis actually presents us this very unique opportunity, an opportunity to lean into radical imagination and dream up a world better than anyone that's ever been in existence.
All right. We'll get to that hope, as I said. Reem, on a scale of 1 to 10, how nervous are you about the climate crisis?
I don't think I can exactly put that number on a scale because I do have very conflicting feelings about it. If I was so nervous, let's say my nervousness, my anxiety was at a 10, that means that I have lost hope. And that means that there's no solution. And I don't believe that. I believe that we should definitely reject the sentiment of climate doomism because that stagnates us, that stagnates progress. And that means that we would lose hope. And that is obviously, we're all about. We're here because we believe we can do something about it. We're here because we believe that it is a solvable issue, and I personally don't like to call it the climate crisis. It's the human crisis, because we are causing it, and we need to solve it, definitely.
Before we continue, Shay, are you afraid?
No.
Why not?
If I operate from a place of fear, then there is little I can do. So I'm not afraid. I'm empowered by the
Nice.
process.
So then let's start with you in terms of this hope you all feel. Scientists say that on our current trajectory, there is just no preventing the world from rising above 1.5 degrees, possibly 2 degrees, possibly 3 degrees Celsius. But you think, and all of you seem to share this hope that this can be fixed. Where does this hope stem from? What do you think can be done?
Where does it stems from? Well, I come from Nigeria. I've seen probably the worst of climate affecting the people. Just recently, 1.5 million people were displaced. We've lost, I think, about $9 billion US from food loss because of increase in temperature and all of this. So I'm really concerned. But am I anxious? Do I think I should be fearful? No. I have seen stories of young people that are doing something. It could be pocket of these things, very small. Here, pocket here, pocket here. But seeing these things, the originality of these things, the contextuality of these things, make me feel like this is just a fraction of what is really possible when young people like us come together to address the problem.
These are beautiful words, I have to say. But there is still a crisis, whether you don't like calling it a climate crisis. There is still a situation that we're so far down the well in that many people just don't have the answers to fixing, particularly when there are huge corporations that more or less run the planet. Their greed is pushing us toward a state of affairs that we just can't pull ourselves from. So what hope is there? Reem?
So as a young person, as a woman, a scientist, and as someone who has worked in both policy and in organizing in community work, I have gone through lots of ups and downs in my beliefs on what the solution is. And then in the end, I reached the solution that there's no one solution. Policy change is very important because that means it's a structural change. You need to put good foundations for the world to run on a better system, but also you need community action. And I'm not going to say individual action, but individual action does lead to community action. So, for example, we live in a different world right now from 2-3 decades ago. Raising awareness has never been easier. The issue we have right now is not raising awareness, it's directing that awareness towards implementable and positive action. So that is what we are doing here today. It's trying to use our knowledge, trying to get our experiences and share them with other young people, to have them join us. Because many young people feel lost. It's not that they don't want to do anything about it, it's just that they don't know what to do. And we definitely can do that together.
All right, so community contributions, awareness might be part of the solution. Clover, do you think everyone here completely understands the gravity of the situation enough that we stop doing those things that we need to stop doing?
Absolutely. I think awareness is higher than it ever has been before, and you don't have to explain to people primarily in the global south living on the front lines of the climate crisis that the crisis is happening. This is not something happening in 30, 40 years' time. Like, this is the lived experience of tens of millions of people around the world. But I do think a lot of the rhetoric of what change looks like is really misguided. You know, we have to acknowledge where we're coming from. The fossil fuel industry, companies like ExxonMobil funneled billions of dollars into climate misinformation in the early 80s. They then employed methods of delay. How do we get governments making commitments scheduled so far into the future that they require no immediate action? One of their more recent tools is deception. How do we place responsibility, not with us, the corporations, but with individuals? Taking a leaf out of the tobacco industry, of beverage industry, of guns. You know, how do we put shame with the individual, guilt with the individual, so that we get off the hook? You know, a great example of this is BP, British Petroleum, which promptly rebranded to Beyond Petroleum, creating the carbon footprint calculator. It was an ingenious marketing ploy to shine attention on you for how long you shower, which light bulbs you use, whether you fly, and deflect attention from themselves. And so still, much of the rhetoric at the center of climate solutions is focused on what are the incremental lifestyle changes we need to make, as opposed to what are the systemic changes that are needed. Now, coming out of COP26 in Glasgow, it was decided that we needed a 45% reduction in global emissions over 10 years. Do you want to guess what percentage of emissions we're on track for?
0?
So we're on track for 1% of a reduction
Close
in
enough.
emissions. And that's based on commitments. That's not based on actions. That's simply what governments say they're going to do. So governments, business, essentially systems of power must fundamentally change if we're to solve this crisis. And that is the message that we need to communicate to people. It's not about changing your lifestyle, although that can be important from a values perspective. It's how do we mobilize people, taking a leaf out of the book of the civil rights movement, the suffragettes, the Stonewall Uprising. How do we come together in collective, acknowledging that the people who continue to benefit and privilege from this system of inequality are not going to give that power up. The power has to come from the people.
Wow, you work with marginalized communities where you are. You try to empower them in terms of climate issues, environmental issues. What challenges do you face with people who already have issues that they're dealing with? Poverty, discrimination, racism, the list goes on. Do they care about the climate?
Yes. So the immediate answer for that last question is yes. People that are experiencing the forefront of the climate crisis do care. In regards to polling in the United States, people of color actually care about the climate crisis more. We are more likely to want to vote on climate, are more likely to want to get involved. But like you said, we are experiencing the brunt of so many different crises at the same time. And I think a lot of this, and especially what you were just talking about, Clover, in regards to this narrative around individual versus corporations and pointing blame, there really is a narrative crisis that exists in the climate and environmental movement. And this narrative crisis has really made it hard for people to begin to connect the dots between how issues, for example, the Black maternal health crisis, how that relates to the climate crisis, how issues regarding food justice and food sovereignty relate to the climate crisis. So people do care, but oftentimes I think the ways that we understand and talk about climate issues can be very siloed, and eco-anxiety is one of them. You know, whenever I talk to friends or family that are in Kenya or elsewhere, and, you know, I say, you know, I'm experiencing eco-anxiety, sometimes people are like, what are you talking about? Like, what is eco-anxiety? But when I begin to discuss the dynamics of what I'm experiencing, people are like, yeah, I definitely experienced that. I'm experiencing a drought. I'm experiencing XYZ, but I didn't have that specific language. So I think what we really need to work towards from a movement perspective is how do we broaden our narrative? How do we include frontline people in the ways that we talk about these dynamics? And how do we also understand that eco-anxiety is, yes, this individual experience that we can have, but it's also a pathway for us to lean into community. I think oftentimes people experience eco-anxiety and they're like, I'm crazy. These emotions are ones that I shouldn't be feeling. There's a lot of guilt around feeling hopeless, anger. And the reality is that it's very emotionally intelligent response to an unnatural circumstance happening in our world. And one of the things that we actually need to move into is understanding that we all are experiencing eco-anxiety. How do we harness these emotions to really lean into community and use that as a tool to really solve the biggest issue of all time?
Let's get into how people have been responding. I mean, on a nearly daily basis, we get images of people protesting, mostly in the global north, Europe, the US. Shay, you were from Nigeria, as you pointed out. You really don't see people protesting on the African continent. I'm not too sure about Nigeria specifically, but how are people there expressing what they want in terms of their government's response to the fossil fuel industry? Are they protesting? Are they free to?
Interesting question. So maybe a popular example that many people know is the Friday for Future. And you get people out of school on Fridays because you want to make a statement. But that's in a place where school is a luxury. Like, you are compelled to go to school, the system allows you to go to school. Not in a place where education is a luxury in this case, yes. Not in a place where education is for the privileged. And if you get to school at all, if there is no flood and you have access to school, if your parents do not lack access to water and send you to go fetch water some miles away and you cannot go to school, then you get into the classroom. It's something to be treasured.
Yeah.
So would you listen to someone saying, let's go on the street and protest? You say, no, I want to learn. And that's why some models that work in the US, respectfully, will not work in places like some parts of Africa, because our problems are different, our contexts are different. But that does not mean we're not doing anything. For instance, some years ago, I got really appalled with waste all over the place. And I said, you know what? I just want to go around and pick that trash. And what did that lead into? A movement that has gone across 20 states across Nigeria, out of 36 states. And it was because the former Minister of Environment thought it was quite interesting. And she made it to it. Yes, let's pick that trash. And people were like, yes, I want to pick that trash. And they were empowered. And we went from state to state, location to locations. Every Saturdays, we were just going to pick trash and empowering people. But it did not stop there. We thought it's not enough to pick trash on a Saturday, and you're going to work on a Monday, and the whole place is littered. So we said there needs to be a policy change. And we began to engage the government. We began to question, like you said, the systems, the likes of Coca-Cola, the likes of Nestle, and say, hey, we pick your bottles from the street every now and then. What are you going to do about it? I've been studying in Sweden, and I compare 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. One has this QR code where you take it to a system and you get some cash. Not in Nigeria. It's just there, just the waste. Deal with it. We don't care. And that's the question we must ask. Companies like Coca-Cola, companies like Nestle, like Unilever, you should care about this thing. It's injustice. You talked a lot about inequality. Why would you design a system or have QR codes on bottles in places in the Nordics, but you would not do that in Africa? But it stems back to the question of infrastructure. Are there the infrastructures to allow this to work? And this is where we must also question our governments. We cannot exempt the role of the governments. And recently, I've been working a lot with policies, like most of you. I've been to the Conference of Parties, COP, for like the last 2-3 years. And I have seen how political these conversations could be. But I still believe that given what we have, it is still the only way to go. And the inclusion of young people is what can change. It is what can make policies work. And I'm excited with the recent climate youth negotiation programs. I'm excited with programs like the Climate Innovation Hub that we're doing in Nigeria, and how this has been not only shaping policies, but also bringing about new solutions.
You raised a lot of issues there, including poverty and how inequality prevents people from reacting how they should. Reem, you work a lot with women's issues. Do you find that in some parts of the world that women have, say, less power, less capabilities in dealing with the climate crisis or contributing to solutions?
Definitely. Being a woman in one part of the world can be a privilege over another. So I work mainly within the Middle East and North Africa. And not just from the perspective of women, but also from a people's perspective, where this region has gone through so many conflicts. And with conflict, you see all these other issues. You see societal injustices, including gender issues as well. So when I was first starting off with trying to come up with an idea, like, what can we do? Because, Shay, you said the same thing. Activism in the West does not look like activism in Africa, and it doesn't look like activism in the Middle East and North Africa either, because our historical, political, socioeconomic contexts are very different. And up till now, all you see in the media is mostly a Eurocentric lens to activism, and that is what we see being hailed. And so us as young people from those regions, we felt powerless because we didn't know what to do, because what is shown to us, this is what activism looks like. And that is not doable where we are. I can't go outside and protest. I can't, and even if I did, people will look at me and tell me, are you joking? People were, my brother, my cousin died in that war. We have water issues, droughts. We don't have electricity. So when you're trying to approach communities such as these, first of all, you have to speak their language, literally and figuratively. And by speaking their language, you have to show them that everything is interconnected. It's not just the climate crisis and then conflict, it's interconnected. By trying to find solutions for the climate crisis, you will find solutions for everything else in society. You'll find solutions for the water crisis, and for injustice as well, like social injustice as well. And so something that I was proud of to do with my colleagues from my region is that we felt like we were pioneering what activism means in our region, because it is a very young movement. I would say the MENA region is one of the latest regions to be engaged, because we have been sort of like pushed away and pushed off with everything that's going on in our countries. And so when we're just starting, we are trying to set that example of like, what can you do in this region? What does it look like? If you can't go outside and protest, what else can you do? There's so much that you can do. Community action. Sometimes people will think reaching out to your policymakers will not work, but definitely try it. I have tried it, and it has worked to an extent. One issue, though, is there is a disconnect between young people and their governments, and there's a loss of faith of people in their governments as well. And that is why it is a very natural response to not even think about the government doing anything. And that is a natural response to focus on grassroots work. For example, I had to gain international recognition for anyone from my government to even contact me. If it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't have been able to even join the Iraqi delegation to COP. So what does that tell you? When I had to go outside, speak at different countries, different conferences, to be able to do my own local work, it tells you that there is a gap. It's a very significant gap. There's a gap in opportunities, there's a gap in communications, and we need to bridge that gap.
All right, so Reem raised an important point that activism, climate activism, just might be a luxury in some places. Clover, in the global north, it seems to be a luxury. Some people go out into the streets, they block traffic. They go to art shows. I can't really say that they deface art because this art is covered in glass. They're not damaged. But they do startling things to get attention and to get people to take notice. Are they going too far?
Absolutely not.
You want to see more?
I mean, again, referring back to every movement that has come before us, the reason why we have the right to vote as women in the UK is because of the women's liberation movement and the suffragettes. Now, what people like to forget is the fact that, the suffragettes literally threw themselves in front of horses. They committed suicide. They planted bombs. They engaged in very direct action in order to fight for what was right. And I think we have to dismantle this idea that, the oppressors are going to liberate the oppressed. It wasn't slave owners that facilitated the civil rights movement. It wasn't police who facilitated queer rights, So it is the people who are on the direct front lines and who understand the climate crisis. And I think for so many young people engaged in direct action in the UK, they participate because they know that that in and of itself is a privilege. You know, I have many friends in the global south who can't participate in protests without fear for their safety. You know, a friend, Elizabeth Watuti, is an amazing climate justice activist. She's had a gun held to her head for protesting in her country, right? And even now, our government in the UK, where we seemingly have the right to protest, they're cracking down on that freedom, right? They're cracking down on our democratic right. So now it's illegal in the UK at times to even hold a sign, to wear a t-shirt that is critical of the system. You can go to jail for 10 plus years. I've had friends go to jail for gluing themselves to the sidewalk. And so, you know, they're cracking down, and there's this mounting kind of feeling of despair because people don't know what else to do, you know, and so they're willing to kind of put their lives and their freedom on the line so that other people don't have to, you know. And we have to acknowledge space in this conversation for the environmental defenders around the world who have sacrificed their lives so that we can have this conversation and so that we can carry forward this movement.
You know, while we're in the US, you guys seem to be true leaders when it comes to climate activism. Activists in the US are so powerful, they almost influence policy. The Biden administration has been listening really closely to what people are saying. He's included hundreds of millions of dollars in climate policy. What do you think the rest of the world can learn in terms of how powerful going out into the streets actually is for the climate issue?
Yeah, you know, I would have to say as well, a lot of these issues that are happening in the UK in regards to folks not having the right to protest in the way that I think the world assumes we can, are happening in the United States as well. Right now, there are tons of discrepancies, particularly when Black, Brown, and Indigenous people congregate and come together in the streets versus a lot of white climate activists. So it's interesting when we think about how climate activism looks in the United States, you don't often see people that look like me at the forefront of the conversations, oftentimes because a lot of the methods of direct action, for example, Extinction Rebellion, a lot of the direct action that had allowed them to become popular were not very accessible to Black and brown folks that unfortunately cannot come face to face with police in the same exact way for fear of our life. And, you know, in the United States, in regards to the ways in which climate activists have been able to influence policy and even make our way up to influencing our president, I think it's an incredible thing to have been a part of and to watch, but I think it's so important for us to understand that this moment that we find ourselves in is not a siloed one, right? We are quite literally leaning on the generational birthright that is youth activism. So much of the work that I do and the work that a lot of us environmental justice scholar activists and advocates in the United States are relying on is the history of the civil rights movement, is the history of Black maternal, grandmothers and mothers that were at the forefront of the civil rights movement and really taking to the streets to ensure that they could provide for a future better than the one that they experienced. And I think what the world needs to do is really listen to Black and Indigenous mothers and matriarchs that know what it's like to fight for a tomorrow that isn't promised. And what's really important is to understand that the climate crisis, Mariana Elise Hegler talks about this all the time, but the climate crisis is not our first existential threat, right? It's the biggest existential threat that we've ever experienced, right? It's the biggest threat to our planet, all of the ecosystems and humans and non-human species, but it's not the first time people have had to fight for their lives before. The end of the world has happened for so many groups of people from all over the world, and that's why actually we need to turn our attention to frontline communities, because frontline communities around the world in the global south, in the global north, are the ones that are creating climate solutions as a means of survival, know what it means to fight for a better future, to make something out of nothing. And that's why when we talk about eco-anxiety, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about all these intersecting issues, we need to be at the forefront because we truly already have the tools. And as everyone's scrambling to figure out what to do, you know, so many folks are saying we actually don't have to reinvent the wheel. We need to utilize the tools that we already have and adapt them to a new challenge that we find ourselves in.
All right, let's help the audience understand how they can themselves contribute. I mean, if you look around at anyone, you might see a lot of plastic on that person. You might see things happening that goes against the climate crisis or actually works in favor of the climate crisis. I'm going to ask you guys a really tough question. I hope you can answer it. I want you to choose an issue. Choose one issue that you would focus on that you would push more than anything else to address the climate crisis. It's so multifaceted, so multidimensional. We can't all do everything. We can't stop driving cars, stop using public transport. We can't stop using our air conditioners, our heaters when it's cold during winter. We can't stop using plastic unless you're using plastic that can be reused. We just can't. We can't stop. Give the audience an idea of one thing you would choose, Shay. One thing they can look at and say, okay, I'm going to focus on this for the rest of the year as my contribution. And then next year, I'll focus on something else. What would that one thing be?
Tashakula, I'm practicing my Turkish. But yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Maybe I can engage the audience a little bit, because this is something I've also been thinking about for a while. So by show of hands, I want to ask you, if I tell you that for the rest of this year, 30 minutes every day, you should cycle instead of using the bus or using a car, how many of you will do it by show of hands? And if okay, just a few people, great. Now, what if I tell you that that little action, I backtrack a little bit. 6th of February, 2023, how many of you remember what happened? I give you the time, 4:17 a.m. Yes, you remember. It was the earthquake. And that 7.8 magnitude earthquake claimed about 60,000 people's lives. Double that by 2, 120 people were injured, severely injured. Now, I ask that question again. What if I told you to cycle 30 minutes every day instead of using the bus? And that will prevent the next earthquake and save lives. By show of hands, how many of you will do that? Interesting. And will you do that out of fear? Will you do that because you are afraid that an earthquake will happen? Maybe not. But you will do it because you want to do it. You want to be part of something meaningful. And as small as that action could be, because you know that this is meaningful, this has an impact, you will go all out. You will make that sacrifice, and you will do it. To answer your question, I am not an advocate for, okay, stop driving cars, stop doing this. I used to do that before. But right now, my focus has been on policies. Because I believe that policies is where things matter. If we get young people to understand how powerful policies can be in their local community, in their country, then engaging young people will not be a function of let's just tick something on the box, or we just want to get some young people into COP delegation, for instance, or we just need some young people to tweet on social media and say, hey, the government is doing these things. When they understand that we as young people, we are humans, we have stories, and we have power to change things through policies, and we can contribute significantly, and we can question authorities like Shell, like BP, like Coca-Cola's. We can question these guys that have a field day just, I don't want to use any swear word, but they just have a field day, you know, spitting on the people. If we can question this and put into context and say, hey, we need this policy to work, then I think a lot of climate issues as we have it today will be solved. More importantly, I think that a lot of innovations, new innovations to bring about solutions will be born. So my answer will be, get young people to be a part of the policy making.
Voting. Voting is one way that you can help cure this climate crisis. Reem, what's your one issue?
So there are so many.
Choose one.
Oh my God. Okay, so as someone who also has done this, so I've done, so last year my organization, MENA Youth Network, we worked on food and agriculture. And that's what we focused on for the entire year. We had a partnership with the World Food Forum. And we worked with policy. We did consultations and produced a youth policy paper. So you may ask, is this going to change anything? Are these policies going to be implemented? It's not about that. It's not our job as someone who's still, you know, as people who are still in university or who are still starting off their careers. we might not be able to access these spaces, many of us. And I am someone who's privileged enough to be able to access such spaces. The point is to engage people, because that's how I started. When I wrote my first policy mock paper, or when I started discussing these topics, I started being more interested. I was like, I can do this. I can, I learn so much every day, and it really shows you a way forward. So for me, definitely policy, but also I am not an advocate for blaming the individual. I've never been, I never will be, because we need infrastructural changes. We can't, if I forget my tote bag at home and my mom calls me, she tells me, go get me some groceries, and I don't have my tote bag, I'm not gonna kill myself for buying a plastic bag, for getting it in a plastic bag, because in the long run, I know I'm doing other work that I'm trying my best to change this infrastructure, to push that change. So it is really a lot of work, and it really, being in the climate space requires so much positivity. You have to be such an optimist, because there is so much every day that is trying to pull you down, that is trying to make you lose hope, to be, there's such desperation. And our optimism comes from the desperation of, like, we know this will work. We know our work will amount to something in the future. So definitely.
All right, so vote, raise awareness, discuss the topic more. We have a couple of minutes left. Clover, what's your one issue?
I'm going to challenge the question because I think it's the wrong one.
Tell me.
Building on the points here, we can encourage people to recycle. But if we don't stop corporations from flooding the world with plastic, then we're ignoring the tsunami to fix a leaky tap. So it's not about individual actions, and especially, to your point, individual actions based in sacrifice. It's about collective activism. And my invitation to anyone is, the reason I'm involved in climate is going to be different from the reason you're involved in climate, and the reason that Shay's involved in climate, and Wawa. So when you're feeling that anxiety and that frustration, to Wawa's point, that is such a gift. It is evidence of your humanity. But rather than doing yourself the disservice of ignoring those feelings, allow them to be the compass that guides you, that says, this is the issue that ignites a fire in my belly. Because the climate crisis is a symptom of many interconnected problems, from the food system, to fashion, to how we get around the places we live, to racial justice, to the prison system. So whatever your problem is, it's important, and it's part of this tapestry. And right now we have a whole lot of problems, and we have a shortage of people putting up their hands and saying, this is the problem I want to fix. So identify the problem that is unique to you, that you feel connected to, and then think about how you can use your passion and energy and draw on your community. I feel like we haven't talked enough about community today, but the people who hold you, the people up here who understand it, who are going to sustain your activism, because this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. When you find that focus of a problem, of your passion, of your community, that is when you step into the ring, and that's when you can step up rather than shut down in the face of the climate crisis.
All right, and Wawa?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think we need to lean into all these emotions that we've been almost trained to feel guilty about. The fear, the hopelessness, the grief, those are the grounding emotions. They're grounded in love. They're grounded in radical love of our communities, of our families, of our collective ecosystems, and also, I'd say, ourselves. So lean into those emotions. And then also, I'd say, use this really helpful tool called the Climate Venn diagram. It was created by Dr. Ayanna Johnson. And it's, if you know, a Venn diagram, 3 circles, 1 circle. If you have a piece of paper, you can do it now, or on your phone or whatever. So in 1 circle, it's what brings you joy, what makes you happy, what gets you up in the morning. Another circle is, what are the skills that I have? If you were to ask a friend, a family member, someone that really knows you, what is something that I uniquely bring to the table? Those are the things in that circle. And then the last circle is, what are the issues that need solving? They could be issues that are in your dorm room, right? It could be issues at your university. It could be issues in your community. These could be federal issues. They could be international issues. in the middle, you're going to find a pinpoint for where your action can stem from. So lean into those emotions, do that climate Venn diagram, and you'll be able to really articulate where your best next step could be. And those individual actions lead to the collective action that leads to the ripple effect of solving this crisis.
I want to thank you all so much for being here. Next, a round of applause for these guys, please, guys. So you've gotten some great advice. You can go out and vote. Find what works for you specifically, what you love, what your skill sets are. Dig into this issue and find out how you can specifically contribute. And of course, speak more among yourselves. Talk, raise more awareness of the climate issues. Of course, you can eat less meat, you can become vegan, you can go right ahead, Reem.
Just as a small exercise after the session, each one of you, because the issue is not, I don't think you have to tell young people what to do. They already have so much drive and they want to do something. So after this session, go up to one stranger around the room and start talking to them. Introduce yourself. Talk about what you're interested in, what your likes are. You will find some kind of intersection. And then you will be motivated to do something together. That's how most of us started, right? Like, we were like, oh, we all agree on this problem, let's find a solution, let's start something. So all of you, I hope that you go up to a stranger, make a new friend today, make 2 or 5 new friends today, and start something that inspires others to do better.
Regan,
all right, guys.
I can make a very short that's fine. Maybe 1 minute.
10 seconds.
10 seconds, good. So what I wanted to say, when I got this invitation, the title was We Need a New Planet, and I thought about it, do we really need a new planet? And my answer is, we're 8 billion people here. The population is not the problem. It's the inequality that is the problem. So we do not need a new planet. We need a new mindset, and we can bring about that by talking to people and engaging other people around us and seeing that collective action, like you've stressed, can make a difference. So we do not need a new planet, folks. To you in the room and to those joining online, we do not need a new planet, but we need a new mindset to sustain the abundance that we have in this planet.
All right, Sharifunme Adebote, we've got Reem Saffar, we've got Clover Hogan, and Wawa Gatheru. Thank you so much again.